Hi everyone, welcome to part one of From Protest to Revolution. Our questions to think about here: what was the impact of the French and Indian War on the British North American colonies? And how did the North American colonists respond to the end of salutary neglect? As I mentioned it before, as we go into this topic, we have to keep in mind that Jamestown was settled in 1607, and the events that we begin here, the French and Indian War, starts in 1754. This is nearly 150 years beyond the foundation of the colonies. And to put that into perspective, we can think about 5 generations of families having grown up in the American colonies. I mean, think about you, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and your great-great-grandparents. If each generation covers about 30 years, then 5 generations in 150 years. So keep that in mind with our timeline here. So the conflict in North America was sparked by the competing claims over the ancestral Indian lands in the Ohio River Valley. In the early 1750s, Virginians, including George Washington's 2 half-brothers, sought to develop roughly 200,000 acres in what is today western Pennsylvania. The intrusion infuriated the French. Both nations realized that control of North America centered on controlling the Ohio River Valley, and both sides recruited Indian allies. So when we take a look at the name of this war, the French and Indian War, it's because the British and the American colonists are fighting not only France, but France's Native American allies. In order to defend their interests in the Ohio River Valley, the French built forts in what is now western Pennsylvania, that is Fort Duquesne. And then in the spring of 1754, George Washington, who was a major in the Virginia military, led 150 inexperienced soldiers and Iroquois Indian allies across the Allegheny Mountains in order to build a fort at the confluence of the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio River, or the 3 rivers where Pittsburgh was later developed. But of course, the French had already beaten him to the punch by erecting Fort Duquesne. Washington, reinforced by more Virginians and British soldiers sent from South Carolina, hastily constructed Fort Necessity, which the French attacked 1 month later. And Major Washington, surrounded by the French, had to surrender after nearly 1/3 of his men were either killed or wounded. Meanwhile, up north, the colonists from New England met to discuss the growing tensions with the French and Indians in the region. The Plan of Union, organized by Benjamin Franklin, called for a central colonial government led by a chief executive, as well as a legislature with 48 members chosen by the colonial assemblies. The purpose was to organize the colonies so they could defend themselves more efficiently and more effectively. To fully understand what Benjamin Franklin is proposing here, we have to remember that each of the original 13 colonies essentially operated as a separate entity. They really did not have much interest in what was happening in the other colonies. So for those living in Jamestown, yes, they might have a trade relationship with Boston in Massachusetts, but they really have no interest in the internal affairs of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts likewise doesn't really care what's happening in Virginia. Each of the colonies are sort of pointed outward. Their vision is pointed outward towards Britain because that was their major relationship. And what Benjamin Franklin is saying here is that the colonists really do need to work together if we're going to be effective in dealing with the French and hostile Native Americans. So to emphasize his point, Benjamin Franklin drew this political cartoon in 1754, saying that the colonists must join or they will die. Now, what's funny about this is many people recognize this political cartoon, but they associate it with the American Revolution and not the French and Indian War. But of course, it is resurrected for a new purpose beginning in about 1775. Although Benjamin Franklin's plan of union was rejected, it would be the model for the form of governance created by the Continental Congress in 1777. It's very similar to what we saw with the Articles of Confederation much later. The Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War was signed in February 1763, and it brought an end to this world war, and it brought an end to the French Empire in North America. Victorious Britain took all of France's North American possessions east of the Mississippi River, including all of Canada and Spanish Florida. In return for the loss of Florida in the Treaty of Paris, Spain received the vast Louisiana territory. The French retained their Caribbean possessions, which were more valuable to them at the time than all of Canada. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Paris, take a look at this map. You'll notice that this interior area is labeled Indian Territory. And what the British have done is they have declared this piece of land off limit to American colonists because they want to avoid additional conflicts in the future with Native Americans. So the Royal Proclamation of 1763 basically draws a line through the Appalachian Mountains and says British colonists cannot settle west of that line. Of course, colonists are going to find this most disagreeable. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War, there is an effort to renegotiate the relationship between the British colonies in North America and the British government back in London. A new chief minister, George Grenville, believed that the American colonists should share more of the costs of the troops that had been provided for their defense. Grenville ordered colonial officials to tighten the enforcement of the Navigation Acts, and under George Grenville, the period of salutary neglect came to a screeching halt. Commonly known as the Sugar Act, which cut the duty on molasses in half in the hope that it would reduce the temptation to smuggle or to bribe customs officials, the Sugar Act also levied new duties on textiles, wine, coffee, indigo, and of course, sugar. There's also an important shift here. This is the first time that Parliament had adopted a so-called external duty designed to raise revenues in the colonies rather than to merely regulate trade. Many of the colonists saw this as an attempt by Parliament to tax them without their consent. The act also, frustratingly for the colonists, canceled trials by jury for those caught smuggling. The problem with the Sugar Act, however, was that it did not produce additional revenue for Great Britain. In fact, the cost of hiring additional custom agents to enforce the act was about 4 times greater than the additional revenue it generated. So in February of 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which created stamps to be purchased and put on every form of printed matter used in the colonies: newspapers, pamphlets, bonds, leases, deeds, licenses, insurance policies, even playing cards. This was the first outright effort by Parliament to place a direct or internal tax on American goods and services rather than an external tax on imports and exports. So I want to emphasize this point for a second here, that this is taxing something that is produced and consumed within the colonies. Everything else has been about imports and exports, but the Stamp Act is, from the colonial perspective, meddling in their internal affairs. So think about, say, a newspaper that is produced within Philadelphia. It is produced in that city, and the people in that city read that newspaper. It's not imported, it's not exported, it's just part of their daily lives. In addition, the Quartering Act of 1765 required the colonists to feed and house British troops. It applied to all of the colonies, but it mainly affected New York City, the headquarters of the British forces. But many people questioned whether it was necessary to station troops in colonial cities during peacetime. So in response, George Grenville had unwittingly stirred up a storm of protest and set into motion a discussion of colonial rights and imperial relations. What should the relationship between the metropole and the colonies look like? The arguments brought an emphasis to the old Whig principle that no Englishman could be taxed without his consent through representative government. Americans who opposed English policies began to call themselves true Whigs in reference to that old British political party, the Whigs. And they labeled the king and his ministers as the Tories, another reference to an old British political party. Critics of the taxes argued that British subjects could only be taxed by their elected representatives in Parliament, but because the colonists had no elected representatives in Parliament, then that body had no right to impose taxes on them. But in response, the British Parliament is going to argue the virtue of virtual representation, whereby all members of Parliament represented all Englishmen, no matter where they lived in the world. But this is where that timeline becomes really important, because whether it's the House of Burgesses in Virginia or the Massachusetts Assembly in Massachusetts, the colonists had become familiar with direct representation. They had a specific person in their legislatures that represented them. And so this concept of virtual representation just didn't make sense to them. They wanted to know the name of their representative. And of course, they didn't have one. So in response to the Stamp Act, we see a wave of protest against this imposition of Parliament, and colonists argued that there could be, quote, no taxation without representation, end quote. And in October of 1765, the representatives from 9 colonies reaffirmed that principle that taxation of the colonies could only be imposed from within the colonies. So when you take a closer look at the document related to this journal, they do a very good job of outlining this argument step by step by step. So take a closer look at that document. Many of the protesters organized meetings, parades, and other demonstrations. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty, and for the women, the Daughters of Liberty. So what Benjamin Franklin was unable to accomplish with the Plan of Union, the British unknowingly helped to push the colonists together. So remember, I mentioned that each of the colonies was really looking outward towards Britain. That was their major economic, political relationship. But now, with these protests, they have a common issue that's bringing the colonists together. Boston had one of the largest organizations, and a lot of this has to do with the urban nature of the northern colonies and Boston's importance as a trading port. Samuel Adams of Boston has emerged as what some historians refer to as the supreme genius of revolutionary agitation. In mid-August 1775, a Boston mob sacked the homes of the lieutenant governor and the local customs officer in charge of enforcing the Stamp Act. So a non-importation agreement was something that was signed by a merchant, and they made this declaration that they were not going to import British-made goods until the British removed the taxes. And then a non-consumption agreement was signed by consumers, and they promised that they wouldn't purchase British-made goods until the British removed the taxes. So think of this as a boycott. They are trying to put economic pressure on the British government to remove these taxes. And this brings us to the role of women in the American Revolution, because oftentimes women were the purchasers for their households. And so this was a way for women to be political, despite the fact that they didn't really have political rights. So coming back to our questions to think about, what was the impact of the French and Indian War on the British North American colonies? It is huge. This is essentially a sea change because the French and Indian War was expensive. It was incredibly costly for the British government. And because part of the war was fought in North America, they really felt like the American colonists should contribute to help paying off that debt. And given how prosperous the North American colonies were, generally speaking, the British government felt like they could afford it. So with the French and Indian War, salutary neglect comes to a screeching halt. The second question, how did the American colonists respond to the end of salutary neglect? With protests. They are definitely opposed to this, especially when it comes down to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress document that they sent to Britain really outlines their idea that virtual representation is inadequate, that they've followed this tradition of, for the last 150 years, of direct representation. And because they were not represented in Parliament, they honestly believed that Parliament did not have the power to tax them. So stay tuned for part 2 of From Protest to Revolution.